De la Donne Hook, 157-2, Sat MUC 150. Contain the exposure. 3 words. And signed. Clipped to a flight log that was never supposed to exist. Kathleen's hands went unsteady for the first time in 14 years of flying into gunfire. Because those 3 words meant Edward Harris hadn't died from weather. He died because he found exactly what she was standing in the middle of right now, inside a warehouse that officially did not exist. Headlights, Angela breathed. Coming up the access road. Fast. The flashlight died. Darkness swallowed the crates whole. Somewhere behind them, engines slowed toward the loading dock, searching the way people search, when they already know exactly what they're hunting for. 8 years of silence, 1 folder, 60 seconds to disappear, before Colonel Jonathan Wright discovered exactly how much 3 people had already uncovered about the man he'd buried. They ran, folder pressed tight against her ribs, the truth finally in her hands, after 8 long years of searching for it.
Now I have the complete text. Here is part 1. The call came in at 2:14 in the morning, and Kathleen Robinson was already awake when it did. She had learned a long time ago that sleep was a luxury the mountains did not respect. Her radio sat on the nightstand, volume low, tuned to the emergency net out of habit more than duty, and when the static broke into a voice she did not recognize, she was reaching for her boots. Before the second sentence finished, Task Force Neptune 7, last confirmed position, the Kestrel Range, 11 miles north of the ridge line. Contact lost. No further transmission. Have you ever laid awake somewhere, waiting for a phone that you knew, deep down, was going to ring? That was Kathleen's whole career. Waiting for the moment, the silence broke. Ironwood Air National Guard Base sat in the high desert of eastern Oregon, a scatter of hangars and revetments pressed against a sky that had not yet decided whether it belonged to night or morning. The operations center smelled like burnt coffee and cold metal. Master Sergeant Joshua Martin was hunched over the radar display. When Kathleen pushed through the door, his headset askew, one hand pressed flat against his ear, as if that alone could pull a signal out of dead air. "Talk to me," she said, already reaching for the mission board. Neptune 7 went dark 17 minutes ago, mid-transmission. They were tracking a convoy through Cutter's Pass, suspected weapons cache, standard surveillance profile, then nothing. No distress call, no emergency beacon, just static. Convoy belonging to who? Martin's jaw tightened, the files still being pulled together, but early word is it's the same trafficking network task force flagged 3 weeks ago. The one running rifles and God knows what else through the backcountry. If they walked into a prepared position, ma'am, this wasn't luck. Someone knew they were coming. The words landed heavier than he probably meant them to. Kathleen had heard variations of that sentence before, in another decade, about another team, and the old wound in her chest gave a low, familiar throb before she shoved it back down where it belonged. "Nearest support," she said. "There isn't any. Highway patrols 40 minutes out on gravel roads that might not survive the weather. State police helicopters grounded for maintenance. You're the only asset that can get eyes on that ridge inside the hour. Get me a bird." She was already moving. Behind her, Colonel George White stepped out of his office in yesterday's uniform, hair still flat on one side from the pillow, and he did not try to stop her, because in 6 years of commanding this squadron, he had learned that trying to stop Kathleen Robinson from launching was like trying to stop weather. "Storm," he said, using the name half the base had adopted without ever asking permission to use it. "You go in solo. You go in smart. I don't want a second missing element on my hands tonight. I don't plan on being careless, Colonel. That's not what I asked." She paused at the door, long enough to look back at him, and there was something in her face that made even a man who had flown combat sorties of his own take half a step back. "I plan on bringing them home," she said. "All of them. That's the only plan I've got tonight." The walk across the flight line took 3 minutes in air cold enough to bite through her flight suit. Her A-10 sat in the 4th revetment, nose pointed toward the black bowl of sky beyond the perimeter fence, and even in the dark, She could pick out every line of it, every rivet, the way you know the shape of someone you've loved a long time. Tale number 780,684. 8 months of deployments etched into its skin in ways only she could read. Because that airplane had never once let her down. Because it had carried her through worse nights than one and brought her home every single time. Until tonight, she reminded herself. Climbing the ladder, that record was still unbroken, and she intended to keep it that way. The crew chief gave her a thumbs up from the shadow of the wing. Loaded and fueled, ma'am. Full cannon load, 2 Maverick missiles, the usual complement. She's hungry tonight, aren't we all? Kathleen said, and dropped into the cockpit like coming home. The engine spun up with that low mechanical growl that had become, over the years, the closest thing she had to a lullaby. She keyed her radio as she taxied. Ironwood Tower, Hog 77, requesting immediate departure, emergency close air support tasking. Hog 77, cleared for immediate takeoff. Winds calm. Contact departure on button 4. Good hunting, Major. The runway lights blurred into streaks as she accelerated, and then the nose came up, and the ground fell away beneath her the way it always did, like something exhaling. 26 minutes to the Kestrel range. 26 minutes to find out whether 6 people were alive, or whether she was flying into a recovery mission instead of a rescue. She used the time the way she used every minute in the air, running through the geometry of the terrain in her head, the narrow defiles and the false summits, the places a convoy could vanish, and the places an ambush could be staged so that a target had nowhere left to run. She knew this range, not from any official briefing. She knew it the way you know a scar, from having been cut by it once before. 8 years ago, in almost this exact stretch of mountain, a training exercise gone catastrophically wrong had taken the life of the only man who had ever taught her that flying wasn't about controlling an aircraft, it was about controlling fear. Colonel Edward Harris had been 41 years old, 3 weeks from retirement, running what should have been a routine coordination flight through a canyon whose weather had turned on a dime. The official report called it pilot error, compounded by a sudden downdraft. Kathleen had read that report so many times she could recite it in her sleep, and every single time, something in the language felt wrong in a way she could never quite name. A discrepancy in the recorded coordinates. A radio transmission that didn't match the flight log. Small things. The kind of things that meant nothing on their own and everything if you stacked them up side by side. She had earned her call sign 3 months after his funeral, though almost no one at Ironwood knew the real reason why, and she preferred it stay that way. Below her now, the terrain began to rise, black ridgelines cutting jagged shapes against a sky just beginning to gray at its eastern edge. She dropped to 8,000 feet and switched her night vision on, and the world resolved into ghostly green contours, canyon walls and scattered pine, and somewhere down there in all that darkness, 6 people who had gone silent 17 minutes ago and hadn't said a word since. Any station, this is Hog 77 on guard frequency. Neptune 7, if you are receiving, respond on any channel. Nothing. Just the wind noise and the low thrum of her own engines, and a silence so complex it felt like something physical pressing against her chest. She flew a slow search pattern along the ridge, scanning, and doubt started working its way in at the edges the way it always did on nights like this, quiet and patient and cruel. What if there was nothing left to find? What if she was 17 minutes too late, and the only thing waiting for her down there was wreckage, and a report she would have to write in the flattest, most careful language the English language allowed. Then she saw it, a flicker, low in a narrow draw between 2 ridgelines, gone almost before her brain registered it. Muzzle flash. She banked hard, brought the nose around, and there it was, unmistakable now, a firefight in progress. The bright staccato flashes of American weapons, cutting against the dirtier orange bursts of something else entirely. Ironwood, this is Hog 77. I have visual contact, active engagement, Kestrel range, grid coordinates transmitting now. Copy, Hog-77. Be advised. Still no radio contact established with Neptune 7. Understood. Descending for positive ID. She dropped to 6,000 feet, close enough now to make out the shape of the trap the moment she saw it, and her stomach turned cold in a way that had nothing to do with altitude. It was textbook. 2 elevated positions on either side of a narrow defile, converging fields of fire, and pinned in the middle of it, behind a scattering of boulders too small to offer real cover, 6 heat signatures that had to be Task Force Neptune 7. Someone had built this ambush with patience. Someone had known exactly where that convoy would be and exactly when. Unknown aircraft, this is Neptune 7 actual. The voice cracked through her headset, weak, half swallowed by static, but unmistakably a live human voice, and something in Kathleen's chest unclenched for the first time since the phone rang. Neptune 7 actual, this is Hog-77. I have your position. I'm prepared to provide immediate fire support. Say your status. Taking fire from elevated positions north and south of our location. 2 wounded, ammunition critical. Grid reference. Requesting danger close support. Repeat, danger close. The commander's voice belonged, she would learn later, to a man named Timothy Clark, and even through the wreckage of a bad radio connection, she could hear something steady underneath the fear, a professional holding the line. Because the alternative was letting his people watch him fall apart. Neptune 7 actual, mark your position with IR strobes if you have them. I will be making runs from the south, targeting the northern position first. Keep your heads down and trust the airplane. Copy that. Hog-77. Strobes are out. 2 pinpricks of infrared light bloomed in her night vision, 50 meters apart, marking the outer edge of a perimeter she could not afford to cross by so much as 10 feet. Everything outside that line belonged to her now. Everything inside it had to stay untouched, no matter what. She rolled into the dive, and the world narrowed the way it always did in these seconds, down to airspeed and altitude, and the small green cross of her targeting reticle drifting across muzzle flashes. She could not yet see with her naked eye, but could feel, somehow, the way you feel a held breath in a room full of people pretending to be calm. The cannon opened up at 6,000 feet, and the sound of it rolled down the canyon like something ancient waking up. 30mm rounds walked across the northern ridge in a line of fire that turned rock and brush. And whatever had been dug in up there into a churn of dust and light, and she pulled up hard, felt the G-force flatten her against the seat, and behind her, the first secondary explosion went off, a stored cache of something that should not have been that close to a firefight going up in a bloom of orange that lit the whole drawer for half a second like daylight. Good hits, came Clark's voice, ragged with relief. Northern position is down. We're still taking fire from the south, maybe 40 meters off our flank. She was already banking for the second run. This was the part of the job nobody back home ever understood. Not really. Not even the people who ask polite questions at dinner parties about what it was like up there. It wasn't heroics. It was arithmetic performed at 400 knots. Angle and distance, and the razor's width of a margin that separated saving 6 lives from ending them by accident. And every one of those calculations had to happen in under 3 seconds because that was all the time the airplane gave her before the numbers stopped meaning anything. The cannon spoke a second time. Fewer rounds now, more precise. And this time, she saw bodies break from cover on the southern ridge and run, saw 2 of them go down, and did not let herself think too hard about that, because thinking too hard about that was how pilots stopped being able to do the job at all. By the 4th pass, the volume of enemy fire had dropped to almost nothing. She climbed back to altitude and circled, scanning for movement, for the telltale heat signature of anyone still willing to fight. Neptune 7 actual, this is Hog-77. I count no active hostile positions. Say your status. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds too long. We have 3 killed in action, Clark said finally. His voice gone flat in the specific way voices go flat when a man is holding himself together by main force. 3 wounded, 1 critical. We need immediate extraction and a secure landing zone. 3 names Kathleen would never know, joined a list she carried without meaning to, a private ledger of every mission that had cost more than it should have, and she circled that drawer for another 31 minutes, while 2 rescue helicopters clawed their way through mountain air, too thin and too unpredictable to make the flight look easy, providing overwatch, watching the thermal landscape below, for any sign the enemy might regroup, until at last she watched 6 figures, 3 of them carried, load onto the helicopters and lift off into a sky just beginning to turn the color of a fresh bruise. Hog 77, this is Neptune 7 actual, came the last transmission, quieter now, worn down to something almost gentle. Thank you. We would not be going home without you. She did not have a good answer for that. She never did. The flight back to Ironwood took 19 minutes, and for most of them, she said nothing at all. Just flew, watching the sun come up over terrain that had swallowed one man she loved 8 years ago, and had almost taken 6 strangers tonight, and somewhere underneath the exhaustion, a small, cold thought was already forming, the kind of thought she wished she could unthink. That ambush had not been an accident of timing. Someone had known where that convoy would be. She had heard that sentence before, about another mission, a long time ago. By the time her wheels touched down, the ground crew and a knot of intelligence personnel were already waiting by her revetment, and she understood, the way you understand weather changing before the first cloud even appears, that this was not going to be a quiet morning. Colonel White met her at the base of the ladder, arms crossed, relief and something more complicated fighting for control of his expression. Talk to me, Storm. 3 wounded, 1 critical. The rest are coming home. He absorbed that the way career officers learn to absorb bad numbers, without flinching, filing it away to be grieved properly later, in private, when the job allowed for it. Ambush was planned, he said, not a guess, a statement. It was textbook, Colonel. Converging fire, kill box terrain, no warning. Nobody sets a trap that clean by accident. White's jaw worked for a moment before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice had dropped low enough that only she could hear it. That's the 3rd flagged operation in 6 weeks. That's gone bad, the moment boots hit that particular stretch of ground. I don't like patterns like that, Major. I like them even less when nobody upstairs seems interested in noticing them. Kathleen said nothing, because there was nothing safe to say yet, only a feeling low in her stomach that had lived there, dormant, for 8 years, and had just woken all the way up. The debrief ran long. It always did on mornings like this. She sat across a folding table from a rotating cast of officers who wanted to know everything: ordnance expended, target sequence, her exact altitude on each pass, and she answered every question in the flat, careful language of someone who had learned a long time ago that precision was the only armor available to her in a room like this. She described the terrain. She described the timing. She did not, because it was not yet fact, mention the small cold thought sitting at the back of her mind about how a supposedly random ambush had lined up so perfectly with a convoy route that should have been known only to a handful of people. A man she did not recognize sat near the back of the room for most of it, silent, dressed sharper than the working uniforms around him, introduced only once briefly as Colonel Jonathan Wright, liaison, Intelligence Coordination Office. He asked no questions. He wrote nothing down. But twice, when she described the exact location of the second ambush position, she caught him glancing at another officer in a way that felt less like professional interest and more like 2 men confirming something they already knew. She filed that away too. She was getting good at filing things away. When the formal session finally broke, she found Sergeant Joshua Martin waiting for her outside, 2 cups of coffee in hand, one of them already extended toward her like a small apology for a morning that owed her far more than caffeine. Figured you could use this, ma'am. She took it gratefully, wrapping both hands around the warmth. You did good work tonight, Martin. You caught the loss of contact fast. That's what got me airborne in time to matter. He looked, for a moment, like he wanted to say something, and thought better of it, and then said it anyway. Ma'am, Can I ask you something? That ambush. The one 3 weeks ago that Neptune 7 was already flagging before tonight. You don't think that's a coincidence either, do you? I think, she said carefully, that I've flown enough of these to know what a coincidence looks like. And I think that wasn't one. Martin's face did something complicated. Mask coat, caught between the relief of being believed and the particular dread of being right about something you very badly wanted to be wrong about. If you're thinking what I'm thinking, ma'am, that means somebody's feeding that network our movements, which means somebody on our side. She did not answer that directly, because answering it directly meant saying a sentence out loud that she was not ready to say yet, not until she had more than a feeling in a room full of officers who asked no follow-up questions. Keep your eyes open, Sergeant. That's all I'm going to say for now. She found Angela Young out at the flight line an hour later, elbow deep in an open-access panel on Kathleen's A-10, muttering at a stripped bolt like it had personally wronged her. Don't tell me she's grounded. Angela didn't even look up. She's not grounded, she's just being dramatic, which frankly I understand. It's been a night, you heard. Ma'am, everyone heard. You put on a light show over the Kestrel Range that half the base watched from the flight line like it was the 4th of July. Except with more crying afterward. Which, again, understandable. Kathleen managed something that was almost a laugh. The first one all night, and dropped onto an equipment crate, while Angela wrestled with the panel. You look like hell, Angela said. No offense, none taken, I feel like hell. Because you flew a solo night mission into a kill box and brought 6 people home -3, which is a sentence I refuse to say out loud again because saying it makes it real and I'm not ready for it to be real yet. So, coffee's cold in my thermos if you want it. It's terrible, but it's caffeinated, and right now, that's basically the same thing as good. I'll take terrible. Angela handed it over without looking, still fighting the bolt, and for a moment, neither of them said anything, which was, Kathleen had learned, one of the great unspoken gifts of a good crew chief. Some people needed to fill silence. Angela let it sit. Then, because apparently the bolt had won, Angela sat back on her heels and looked at her properly for the first time. Okay, real talk. You've got that face. What face? The face you make when something's chewing on you that isn't the mission. I've known you 3 years, Robinson. I know your mission face. This isn't it. Kathleen turned, the coffee cup in her hands, watching the last of the steam curl off it into the cold morning air. Ambush was planned, she said finally. Not random. Somebody knew exactly where that convoy would be, exactly when, and exactly how to set the kill zone. That's the 3rd operation in 6 weeks that's gone wrong. The second boots hit that stretch of the Kestrel Range. Angela's expression sharpened, all the easy humor draining out of it at once. That's not a coincidence, that's what I said. So who? I don't know yet, but there was a man in my debrief this morning who didn't ask a single question the whole time and knew exactly where the second ambush position was before I'd finished describing it. Angela set down her wrench with the deliberate care of someone who suddenly did not trust her own hands. That's the kind of sentence that gets people reassigned to weather stations in Alaska, Robinson. You want to be careful who you say that to. I know. You don't sound like you're going to be careful. Kathleen looked out toward the mountains, gray and indifferent in the growing light, the same mountains that had taken Edward Harris from her 8 years ago, under circumstances that had never quite added up, and something in her settled, quiet and immovable, the way a decision settles once it's actually been made, rather than merely considered. I lost someone in those mountains a long time ago, she said. Report called it pilot error. I never believed that report for one single day, and now 6 people almost died up there tonight, because somebody on the inside is playing games with operation security, and I am done pretending I don't notice patterns just because noticing them is inconvenient for somebody's career. Angela was quiet for a long moment, then, slower, more serious than Kathleen had heard her. In 3 years of shared coffee and stripped bolts, she said, "You're talking about Colonel Harris." "I'm talking about Colonel Harris. Robinson." That was 8 years ago, which is exactly long enough for people to stop asking questions about it, Except I never stopped. I just stopped asking them out loud. The two of them sat there a while longer, the base waking up in slow increments around them, engines starting somewhere down the flight line, the ordinary machinery of a working morning grinding forward, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. And it was Angela, eventually, who broke the silence, with the kind of blunt practicality that had made her indispensable in the first place. "If you're really going to pull on this thread," she said, "you're going to need someone who can read a maintenance log and a supply manifest without falling asleep, because I promise you, whatever's going on, there's a paper trail. There's always a paper trail. Nobody moves weapons or intelligence without leaving fingerprints somewhere boring enough that nobody bothers to check it. You offering? I'm offering coffee and moral support, and possibly felony-adjacent document access, depending on how annoyed I get. Don't make me regret it." Kathleen almost smiled. "It won't come to that. It always comes to that," Angela said, picking her wrench back up. "That's kind of the whole problem with you, Robinson. You say things won't come to that, and then they do, and I end up elbow deep in somebody's filing cabinet at 2 in the morning, wondering how my career got here. The morning wore on the way. Mornings after bad nights always did, in increments too small to notice individually and too heavy, together, to ignore." Kathleen filed her mission report. She called her mother, who had seen something on the news about activity in the mountains and needed to hear her daughter's voice say the word fine, even though fine was doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. She checked on her aircraft, listened to the crew chief's assessment, thanked the ground crew personally, the way she always did, because they were the ones who made sure her airplane came back in one piece, even when nothing else about the night had gone according to plan. It was late afternoon, the light gone gold and low across the flight line, when Joshua Martin found her again, and this time there was no coffee in his hands, only a small evidence bag, and an expression that told her the day was not, in fact, done delivering bad news. "Ma'am. Recovery team pulled this off the ambush site this afternoon." He held it up. Inside the clear plastic sat a small, badly damaged piece of electronics, blackened at one edge, a tangle of exposed circuitry that meant nothing to Kathleen's untrained eye, except for one detail that meant everything. "That's not standard trafficking network gear," Martin said. "That's not anything we've seen this network use before. But I ran the serial fragment through what's left of the housing, and ma'am, it partially matches a supply lot. Military supply lot, one that was logged as lost in transit 14 months ago." "Lost in transit where?" Martin's throat worked once before he answered, and when he did, his voice had gone very quiet, the way voices go quiet, when the person speaking has already understood the size of what they're saying before the listener has caught up. "Right here, ma'am. Ironwood, somewhere beyond the flight line." The sun kept sliding toward the mountains, indifferent, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't make the ground underneath, that wouldn't make the ground, both their careers, feel considerably less solid than it had that morning. Because if the report was right, and because if the serial number matched, then whatever had nearly killed 6 people in the Kestrel Range last night had not walked in off some smuggler's black market at all. It had walked out of this base, past this base's own security, under somebody's watch, and somebody had let it happen, which meant the question was no longer whether Edward Harris had died because of a system that failed. It was whether he had died because a person inside that system had made it fail on purpose, and whether that same person, whoever they were, was still standing somewhere on this base right now, close enough to shake her hand. Kathleen took the bag from Martin's fingers and held it up to the fading light, turning it slowly, watching gold catch on broken circuitry, like something almost beautiful, and somewhere underneath the exhaustion of a night that had already cost 3 lives, a colder, steadier feeling was settling into place, one she recognized from 8 years ago, and had never quite managed to put down since. She was going to find out who. Except knowing that and doing something about it were 2 entirely different problems, and she understood the difference well enough not to make her next move stupid, because a lieutenant colonel who wrote nothing down and asked no follow-up questions did not become a lieutenant colonel by accident. Whoever was behind this had spent a career learning exactly how paperwork worked, which meant the paperwork was exactly where they would have been careful. So she did not walk into supply. She did not request records through official channels. She went home first, showered off a day that had asked more of her than most weeks did, and lay on top of her rack, staring at a ceiling she had stared at 100 nights before, running the serial fragment Martin had given her over and over in her head, until the numbers stopped looking like numbers and started looking like a door. 14 months. Lost in transit 14 months ago, which put it right around the time task force operations in this sector had quietly expanded. Right around the time 3 new liaison officers had rotated through Ironwood on temporary orders that somehow kept getting extended. She didn't have names for all 3 yet. She had one. Jonathan Wright. She said it out loud once alone, in the dark of her quarters, just to see how it felt leaving her mouth. It felt like an accusation she had no proof for yet, which was exactly the kind of thing that got careers ended before the truth ever caught up to it. So she made herself a promise before she let sleep take her. The same promise she'd made 8 years ago and broken by simply running out of evidence. This time she wasn't going to run out. This time she was going to build the case brick by brick, quiet enough that nobody upstairs noticed until it was already too heavy to bury. The next morning arrived gray and low, clouds sitting on the ridgeline like they'd decided to stay a while, and Kathleen was at the hospital wing before most of the base had finished its coffee. Timothy Clark was sitting up in his bed when she found him, arm in a sling, a bandage taped along his jaw where shrapnel had opened a shallow cut the night before, and he looked up when her boots hit the linoleum with the particular alertness of a man who hadn't slept much either. Didn't expect a house call, Major. Wanted to see for myself that you were still breathing. Radio traffic only tells me so much. Breathing, mostly intact. He shifted, wincing. Lost 3 good men up there. Wasn't sure I'd get to say thank you to the person who kept that number from being 6. You don't owe me that. I'm saying it anyway. His eyes went somewhere distant for a second. The mountains, maybe, or the memory of them. Can I ask you something? And I want a real answer. Not the kind you give in a debrief. Depends what it is. That ambush. You think it was bad luck, or you think somebody set us up, because there it was. The same question sitting in his chest that had been sitting in hers since the moment Joshua Martin's voice had cracked over the word Ironwood. And she found herself answering before she'd fully decided to. I think it was set up. I don't have proof yet. I intend to get some. Clark studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, calculation replacing grief for just long enough to be useful. If that's true, and if you go looking, you're not going to find friendly faces at the end of it. I didn't expect to. Then I want in. Whatever this is. His jaw tightened. 3 of my men are dead, because somebody sold our route to people who wanted us dead. I don't care whose desk that leads back to. I want to be standing there when you knock on it. You're benched, Clark. Medical hold, minimum 2 weeks. I can read a supply manifest from a hospital bed, same as anywhere else. A ghost of a smile crossed his face, thin but real. Give a wounded man something to do besides stare at a ceiling and replay the worst night of his life on a loop. She hesitated, weighing risk against usefulness, and landed, as she usually did, on the side of not turning away help when it was offered honestly. I'll keep you looped in. Quietly works for me. She left the hospital wing with something that felt, for the first time since the phone rang 2 nights ago, almost like momentum, and momentum was a feeling she intended to keep hold of for as long as it lasted. Joshua Martin caught up with her outside the operations building, moving at the particular fast walk of someone who had found something and couldn't wait to say it out loud, and the moment he opened his mouth, she knew whatever it was going to complicate the picture rather than clarify it. Ma'am, I pulled the personnel roster for anyone with logistics access during the transit window on that missing supply lot. He held out a printout, and she scanned it fast, names and dates blurring together until one name snagged and refused to let go. Most of it's routine, standard rotation, except one name stands out. Staff Sergeant Nicholas Allen, supply chain. He processed the transfer paperwork for that exact shipment 14 months ago, and get this, he requested a transfer off logistics duty 2 weeks after it went missing. Cited personal reasons, nobody followed up. Where's he now? Still here. Reassigned to vehicle maintenance. Keeps his head down, because that was a name and a face she hadn't expected. This early. And something in her gut told her it wasn't going to be as simple as walking up and asking him a direct question. Not if he'd spent 14 months building a wall between himself and whatever he knew. She found him that afternoon in the motor pool, a lean man in his late 20s with a kind of nervous energy that read less like guilt and more like a person who had learned to flinch at unexpected attention and never fully unlearned it. He was elbow deep in an engine bay when she approached, and his whole body went rigid the second he registered who was standing behind him. Major Robinson. He straightened too fast, wiped his hands on a rag that had long since stopped being useful for wiping anything. Something I can help with. 14 months ago. A supply lot went missing on your watch. I'd like to hear about it. Something flickered across his face, there and gone so fast she almost missed it. Except she'd spent 14 years learning to read faces under pressure, and his told her more in that half-second than his next several sentences would. I filed the incident report at the time, ma'am. Everything's documented. Shipment discrepancy, inventory error, nothing unusual for that volume of transfer traffic. Nothing unusual. She let the words sit a beat before continuing. You requested a transfer off logistics 2 weeks later. That's a fast pivot for something you're calling routine. Personal reasons. What kind? He looked away toward the open engine bay, toward anything that wasn't her eyes. The kind I'd rather not discuss, ma'am. With respect, Sergeant. She kept her voice level, the way she'd learned to keep it level in a cockpit with rounds coming up at her. Calm, doing more work than volume ever could. 3 men died 2 nights ago because somebody's equipment ended up in the wrong hands. If that equipment traces back to your shipment, this stops being a paperwork problem for you real fast. He went pale, and for a moment she thought he might actually answer her, might let whatever he was carrying spill out, right there over an open-engine bay, and then something behind his eyes closed, like a door shutting, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone flat and rehearsed in a way that told her exactly how many times he'd practiced saying it. I don't know anything about that, ma'am. If there's nothing else, I've got a vehicle to finish before end of shift. She let him go, because pushing harder in an open motor pool with witnesses within earshot wasn't going to get her anything but a formal complaint filed against her by end of day. But she filed the interaction away in the same growing ledger, where everything else was going, next to the serial number, next to Jonathan Wright's silent attention during her debrief, next to 8 years of unanswered questions about a canyon 2 ridgelines over from where Widow Six had nearly died 2 nights ago, because Nicholas Allen was scared, and scared men didn't stay quiet forever. They just needed the right kind of pressure applied in the right place, and she intended to find it. The confrontation with Colonel Wright came sooner than she expected, and not on her terms. He found her in the officer's mess that evening, sliding into the seat across from her tray without asking, which told her something about how he operated before he'd said a single word. Up close he had the kind of practiced pleasantness that made people trust him by default. An easy smile that never quite made it all the way to his eyes. Major Robinson, quite a night you had. Colonel Wright. She kept eating, unhurried, refusing to let him see he'd interrupted anything. Something I can do for you. Just wanted to extend my compliments. What you did up there, solo, at night, danger close, that's the kind of flying that gets written up in training manuals. He paused, and the pause carried weight. The way a held breath carries weight right before someone says the thing they actually came to say. I also wanted to check in. I understand you've been asking some pointed questions today, about supply logistics, about personnel. Because there it was, faster than she'd expected. Confirmation that whatever network existed on this base had eyes that reported quickly, and she felt something cold settle into her spine, even as she kept her expression carefully neutral. Just doing my job, Colonel. Trying to understand how an ambush that size got built without anyone flagging it. Admirable instinct. His smile didn't waver, but something underneath it did. Some small recalibration she caught because she'd spent 14 years learning to read the difference between a man being friendly and a man managing a situation. Can I offer a piece of advice? One officer to another. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do after a mission like that isn't flying back into the mountains. It's chasing a theory that doesn't have anywhere solid to land yet. I'd hate to see a pilot with your record get tangled up in something that ends up going nowhere. Is that a warning, Colonel? It's advice. He stood, straightening his uniform with unhurried precision. Advice from someone who's watched careers get derailed by good instincts pointed in the wrong direction. Get some rest, Major. You earned it. He walked away before she could answer, and she sat there for a long moment, tray forgotten in front of her, turning the conversation over the way she'd turn a piece of wreckage, overlooking for the part that told the real story, because that hadn't been advice. That had been a message. And the fact that he'd felt the need to deliver it in person, less than 24 hours after she'd started asking questions, told her more about how close she'd already gotten than any confession would have. She found Angela and Joshua that night, in the back corner of the maintenance hangar, the one spot on base, with enough noise from running equipment to make a private conversation genuinely private, and she laid it all out for them in the flat, careful language she'd have used in any other briefing, except this briefing had no official record and no chain of command behind it, only 3 people who had decided, independently and for their own reasons, that the truth mattered more than the risk of chasing it. Wright knows we're looking, she said. He came to me directly, framed it as advice. It wasn't advice. Angela's jaw tightened. That's fast, too fast, honestly, which means either he's paranoid by nature or somebody told him exactly what Alan said to you this afternoon, word for word, within hours, which means Alan reported the conversation, Joshua said quietly. Or somebody was watching the motor pool. Or both, Kathleen said. Either way, we're not dealing with one person acting alone. We're dealing with something that has enough reach to move information fast, and enough confidence to warn me off in person, instead of just staying quiet and hoping I lost interest, because that was the part that scared her most. More than the mountains had. More than the memory of Edward Harris's name carved into a memorial wall she still hadn't made peace with after 8 years. A single corrupt officer was a tragedy she could report and let the system handle. A network with reach into logistics, into intelligence, into whatever channel had told Wright about her conversation with Alan within hours. That wasn't a tragedy anymore. That was an organization operating quietly, inside the wire, for at least 14 months, and possibly much longer. So what do we do? Angela said, and for once there was no humor in her voice at all, just the flat seriousness of someone who understood exactly how much bigger this had just become. Kathleen looked between them, 2 people who had chosen, without hesitation, to stand next to her on the edge of something that could end all 3 of their careers if it went wrong, and felt something steady settle into her chest that hadn't been there in 8 years. Not fully. Not since the day she'd stopped believing anyone would ever help her ask the right questions about Edward Harris. We keep building the case, she said, quietly. No official channels until we have enough that it can't be buried. Joshua, I need everything you can pull on Wright's assignment history. Every base he's rotated through in the last 5 years, cross-referenced against any other operation that's gone sideways the way ours did. Angela, you said you had access to maintenance logs and supply manifests. I need every discrepancy report filed in the last 18 months, not just the one that matches our serial number. And Alan, Angela said. Alan's scared, not guilty. Not fully, anyway. Scared men can be turned into witnesses if you give them a reason to believe you'll protect them. Kathleen exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the last 2 days settle into something she could actually carry instead of something crushing her. I'll work on that part myself. The plan, such as it was, held together for exactly 11 hours. She woke before dawn to the sound of someone at her door, sharp knuckles against thin plywood, and when she opened it, she found Joshua Martin standing there in yesterday's uniform, eyes wide with the particular alarm of a man who hadn't slept and wasn't going to for a while longer. "Ma'am, you need to come see this." The evidence locker sat at the back of the intelligence tent, a modest steel cabinet secured with a combination only 3 people on base were supposed to know, and when Kathleen reached it, the door was standing open, the small clear bag that had held a piece of scorched circuitry from the Kestrel range, now sitting empty on the shelf, where it had been logged less than 18 hours earlier. "Gone," Joshua said, unnecessarily, because she could see that for herself, and something cold and furious moved through her chest at the sight of the empty bag, at the careful, deliberate absence of the one physical piece of proof that connected this base to an ambush that had killed 3 people. "Who has access to this locker?" 3 names on the combination list. Me, you, and the duty intelligence officer for the week. Joshua's voice had gone very quiet. "That's Colonel Wright, ma'am. He rotated onto duty officer status 2 days ago. Because of course he had. Because whoever was running this had positioned themselves exactly where they needed to be, exactly when they needed to be there, with the kind of patience that told her this wasn't improvisation. This was a person who had been managing risk like this for a long time, calmly, methodically, staying 2 steps ahead of anyone careless enough to start asking questions out loud. She stood there in the gray pre-dawn light of the intelligence tent, staring at an empty evidence bag that represented the only tangible proof she had that Edward Harris's death and Widow Six's ambush and whatever Nicholas Allen was too frightened to say out loud were all threads of the same rope, and felt the full weight of what she was actually up against settle into her spine for the first time. This wasn't going to end with a quiet conversation and a formal report. Whoever had taken that bag had just told her, without saying a single word, exactly how far they were willing to go to keep their secret buried. "They know we're close," she said, finally, and her voice came out steadier than she expected, steadier than she felt, "which means we don't have the luxury of moving slowly anymore. What do we do?" She looked out through the tent flap at the mountains, gray and patient in the thin early light, holding whatever secrets they'd been holding since long before any of this started, and felt something harden inside her that had been softening for 8 long years under the weight of unanswered questions. "We find another way to prove it," she said, "and we find it before they realize we haven't stopped. Because somewhere on this base, close enough that she might have already shaken his hand, sat someone who had traded American lives to protect a secret worth killing over, and Kathleen Robinson had learned a long time ago, in a canyon 2 ridgelines over from where 6 people had nearly died 2 nights ago, that some debts didn't go away just because the people who owed them thought enough time had passed. She was not going to stop asking the question. Not this time. Not until she had a name and proof and enough of both to make sure whoever it was never got the chance to do this again. Colonel White found out about the missing evidence bag before Kathleen had a chance to report it herself, which told her something about how fast information was already moving through channels she didn't control. He caught her outside the operations building, his expression carrying none of the easy exhaustion from 2 mornings ago, replaced now with something tighter, more guarded. "Somebody cleared that locker," he said. "No preamble, no greeting. I want to know if you think that was carelessness or something else." "I think it was deliberate, sir. You understand what you're saying if you're right." He kept his voice low, glancing once toward the open door behind him before continuing. "You're saying someone with clearance to that evidence. Someone inside this command made sure the one physical link between an ambush that killed 3 of our people and whatever's actually going on here disappeared inside 18 hours. That's not a paperwork problem, Robinson. That's obstruction. And obstruction on something this size doesn't happen because one nervous sergeant panicked. No, sir, it doesn't. He studied her for a long moment, and something in his face shifted. The calculation of a career officer weighing how much rope to give a subordinate chasing something that could just as easily end her career as vindicate it. I can't authorize an open investigation on a theory and an empty evidence bag. You know that. Command's going to want more than a feeling before anyone upstairs starts asking the kind of questions that get generals uncomfortable. I know. Then get me more. He held her gaze a beat longer than strictly necessary, and something passed between them that felt, for just a moment, like the ghost of every other quiet conversation two officers have when neither one is willing to say the dangerous thing out loud in a hallway. And Robinson, whatever you're building toward, be careful who sees you building it. I've watched good officers get quietly reassigned out of this command for asking the wrong questions at the wrong time, and I would prefer you not become an example of that particular lesson. Understood, sir. He walked away without another word, and Kathleen stood there a moment longer in the cool morning air, turning his warning over the way she'd turned over everything else in the last 2 days, and found that, instead of frightening her, it had done the opposite. It had confirmed, in the careful language career officers used when they meant more than they were willing to say plainly, that she wasn't imagining the shape of what she was chasing. She spent that morning doing the one thing she had avoided doing for 8 years, which was pulling the original incident file on Edward Harris out of the personal box, where she kept the things she couldn't quite throw away and couldn't quite look at either. The folder had gone soft at the corners from handling, the staple long since rusted, and she spread the pages across her narrow bunk in the gray morning light like evidence, in a case that had never officially been reopened, because nobody with the authority to reopen it had ever believed there was anything to find, because she remembered the day it happened with a clarity that 8 years hadn't dulled even slightly. A coordination flight, routine on paper, running a mapping sweep through terrain that should have posed no serious risk to a pilot as experienced as Harris. Weather reports that afternoon had called for scattered cloud, nothing that should have grounded a routine sortie, and then, without warning, a downdraft strong enough to overwhelm an aircraft that had never once let him down before. That was the official story. That was the story that had gone into the report, into the memorial ceremony, into the folded flag someone had handed to his sister at a funeral. Kathleen had attended in a dress uniform that felt, that day, like the heaviest thing she had ever worn, except the flight log didn't match the weather report. She had noticed it years ago and never been able to do anything with the observation, because noticing a discrepancy and proving it meant something were two very different exercises, and she had lacked, back then, both the standing and the courage to push past the first one. The transponder data showed Harris's aircraft 11 minutes ahead of where his filed flight plan said he should have been, which meant either the flight plan was wrong, or he had deviated from it, or someone had altered one of the two documents after the fact to make them look consistent when they weren't. 11 minutes. She had turned that number over in her mind so many times across 8 years that it had stopped feeling like a fact and started feeling like a wound that refused to close, a small persistent ache she carried into every cockpit she'd ever climbed into since. Now, spread across her bunk beside the transponder printout, sat a second discrepancy she hadn't had 8 years ago, a supply lot logged missing 14 months back, a serial fragment that matched equipment recovered from an ambush site 2 nights ago, and a colonel who had known the location of that ambush's second firing position before she'd finished describing it in her debrief. Because if you laid all of it out together, side by side, the way she was laying it out now, on a government-issue bunk, in the gray, early light of a morning that already felt heavier than it should, the pattern stopped looking like a coincidence and started looking like a system. A system that had been running for at least 8 years, maybe longer, quietly diverting equipment, quietly feeding information to whoever was willing to pay for it, and quietly making sure that anyone who got too close to understanding how it worked ended up filed under pilot error or mechanical failure or bad luck in the mountains. She had been that close once before, 8 years ago, and she had let it go, because letting it go had felt, at the time, like the only survivable option available to a young captain, with no evidence and no allies willing to stick their necks out beside her. She was not that captain anymore, and this time she had allies. Angela found her there an hour later, papers still spread across the bunk, and stood in the doorway for a long moment taking in the sight of it before she said anything at all. "You've been sitting with this a long time, haven't you? 8 years. And you never told anyone." "I told the investigating board 8 years ago. They closed the file in 6 weeks and called it grief clouding my judgment." Kathleen gathered the pages carefully, the old habit of protecting something fragile taking over even now. "After that, I stopped telling people. Telling people didn't change the outcome. It just made me the pilot with the conspiracy theory about her dead mentor." Angela crossed the small room and sat on the edge of the bunk, careful not to disturb the papers, and for a moment, she didn't say anything clever at all, just looked at the transponder printout with the flat, focused attention she usually reserved for engine diagnostics. 11 minutes, she said finally. 11 minutes he shouldn't have been able to explain, and the flight log conveniently doesn't ask him to. That's not grief-clouding judgment, Robinson. That's a discrepancy a first-year maintenance tech could spot. Angela looked up. Why did nobody push on this? Because pushing on it meant accusing someone, and I didn't have a name. I still don't. Not really. I have a colonel who shows up wherever this story goes, and a scared sergeant who won't look me in the eye. Kathleen exhaled slowly. But I have more now than I had then. And I'm not walking away from it this time just because it's dangerous. Angela was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost its usual edge of humor entirely, replaced by something steadier, more deliberate. Then you're not doing this alone. I mean that. Whatever happens next, you don't get to decide you're protecting me by cutting me out of it. I've got access to 18 months of maintenance and supply records, sittings on a drive in my quarters right now. And I already found something this morning I think you're going to want to see. Kathleen straightened. What? 3 other operations over the last year that had equipment failures or comm blackouts flagged as unusual in the after-action reports. All 3 got closed out fast, no follow-up investigation, all 3 signed off by the same reviewing officer. Angela pulled a folded printout from her jacket and handed it over. Guess whose signature? Kathleen unfolded it, and even before her eyes found the name at the bottom of the page she already knew, with a particular sick certainty of a suspicion finally confirmed, exactly whose signature she was going to see. Jonathan Wright. 4 operations, she said quietly. Ours makes 4, all flagged as unusual, all closed fast, all signed off by the same man. 4 that we know about. Angela's jaw was tight. How many more are sitting in a filing cabinet? Somewhere. That nobody's cross-referenced yet. Because why would they, until somebody like you comes along and starts asking the wrong questions on purpose? Because that was the real horror sitting underneath all of it. Worse than the ambush. Worse even than the empty evidence bag from that morning. If this pattern went back a year, and if it connected to something 8 years older that had cost Edward Harris his life, then this wasn't a single bad actor exploiting a single moment of opportunity. This was infrastructure, built patiently, maintained carefully, protected by a man who had learned exactly which reports to close fast, and which questions never to let get asked out loud in the same room twice. She thought about Timothy Clark, in his hospital bed, offering to help from a place he could barely move his own arm, and about 3 names she still didn't know that belonged to men who had died 2 nights ago, because someone had sold their route for reasons that had nothing to do with the mission, and everything to do with money, or leverage, or whatever currency this kind of betrayal traded in. She thought about Nicholas Allen's face going pale in an open motor pool bay. A man carrying a secret heavy enough to reroute an entire career just to get away from it. She thought about 8 years of carrying a grief that everyone around her had quietly decided was just grief. Grief, nothing more. A young officer's inability to accept an honest tragedy. None of it had been honest. She was almost certain of that now. Certain in the particular way that came from finally having enough pieces of a pattern laid out in front of her that the shape of the whole thing had become impossible to unsee. "We need Alan to talk," she said. "Officially, on record, protected. Whatever fear is keeping him quiet, we need to give him a bigger reason to break that silence than whatever reason is keeping him in it. That's going to take more than a conversation in a motor pool." "I know." Kathleen folded the papers back together. Careful, deliberate, the way she'd learned to handle anything fragile enough that a single wrong move could destroy it. "Which is why I need you to keep pulling records. Quietly. And I need Joshua to find out everything he can about Wright's history, without Wright noticing anyone's looking. And I need to find a way to talk to Alan, somewhere. Wright's network can't hear about it within the hour." "You think Alan's being watched?" "I think everyone connected to this is being watched, including us, starting sometime in the last 18 hours. Kathleen looked toward the small window of her quarters, toward a sliver of gray mountain visible past the perimeter fence, toward terrain that had already taken one person she loved and had nearly taken 6 more 2 nights ago. "Which means from here on, nothing we do can look like what it actually is." The rest of that day passed in the strange, taut rhythm of a base carrying on with its ordinary business, while 3 people inside it quietly built a case against someone still walking those same gravel paths, eating in that same mess hall, sitting 2 chairs down at that evening's mandatory safety briefing, with the same easy, practiced smile he'd worn in the office's mess the night before. Kathleen sat through the briefing without hearing a word of it, watching right out of the corner of her eye, cataloging small things she hadn't bothered noticing before. The way he never quite finished his coffee, the way his gaze moved across a room like he was counting exits without meaning to, the way when Colonel White mentioned in passing that the Kestrel Range investigation was still open. Wright's expression didn't change at all, not even slightly, which was its own kind of tell, because genuinely surprised people's faces did something, and his did nothing whatsoever. She left the briefing early, citing exhaustion nobody questioned, given the last 48 hours, and found Nicholas Allen exactly where she hoped she would, alone in the motor pool break room, finishing a late shift with the particular hollow look of a man who hadn't slept properly in longer than 2 days. "I told you I don't know anything," he said, before she'd even fully stepped through the door, not looking up from the coffee he was stirring with more attention than coffee generally required. "You told me that in an open bay with 3 other mechanics, close enough to hear every word." She closed the door behind her, quiet, deliberate. "I'm not asking you to say anything here that you're not ready to say. I'm asking you to listen to something first." He looked up then, wary, but listening. 3 men died 2 nights ago. Their equipment was compromised by hardware that traces back to a shipment that went missing on your watch 14 months ago. "I don't think you did that on purpose, Sergeant. I think somebody put you in a position where staying quiet felt safer than telling the truth. I've been in that position myself a long time ago over something that cost a man I respected his life. I let the silence win. I've regretted it every single day since." Something in his face shifted, cracked just slightly along a seam that had clearly been holding for a very long time, and for a moment she thought he was going to say something, the words visibly gathering behind his teeth, before he swallowed them back down. "You don't understand what you're asking me to do," he said, finally, voice barely above a whisper. "It's not about getting in trouble, ma'am. It's about what happens after, to people I care about." Because there it was, the shape of the threat finally coming into focus. Not just a career on the line, but something personal, something with teeth, and Kathleen felt her chest tighten with a fresh, colder kind of anger at the understanding that whoever was running this had made sure fear alone would be enough to keep a scared young sergeant silent for over a year. "Then let me protect them," she said. "Give me something. Not everything, not yet, not until I can guarantee your safety and theirs. Just enough to keep building. A name, a location, anything." He was quiet for a long moment, coffee going cold in his hands. And when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped so low she had to lean in to catch it at all. "There's a warehouse, off-base, private contractor lease, out past the old grain silos on Route 9. His hands were shaking now, just slightly. "That's where the discrepancy shipments actually went. Not lost, rerouted. I only know because I was the one who signed the transfer manifest, and I was told, very clearly, that questioning it would be a mistake I couldn't take back." "Who told you that?" His eyes flicked toward the door, toward the base beyond it, and when he answered, "What?" His voice had gone flat with fear rather than defiance. "I never saw his face directly, ma'am. Just his voice on a phone I wasn't supposed to have. But I know the initials that were signed on the authorization paperwork I was told to file without asking questions." He set the coffee cup down with a hand that had gone visibly unsteady. "JW." The break room went very quiet. Somewhere outside, an engine turned over in the motor pool bay, ordinary and indifferent to the fact that a name had just been confirmed inside these four walls that was going to change the shape of everything that came after it. "Thank you," Kathleen said finally, and meant it more than the two words could carry. "I need you to stay exactly as visible and exactly as ordinary as you've been for the last 14 months. Don't change your routine. Don't act different. I'll find a way to make sure whatever comes next doesn't land on you." "You can't promise that." "No," she said, "I can't. But I can promise I won't stop until it's true." She left the motor pool with a location burned into her memory and a name she'd suspected for 2 days finally. Spoken out loud by someone with enough proximity to the truth to make it real, and the whole walk back across the darkening base, she felt the shape of the next move settling into place with a clarity that hadn't existed 24 hours earlier. A warehouse, off-base, private lease. A place built specifically to sit outside the reach of the same investigative process that had closed 4 operations fast and buried 1 canyon's worth of unanswered questions for 8 straight years. She found Joshua and Angela waiting for her in the maintenance hangar, and the moment she said the word warehouse, both their faces changed in ways that told her they understood immediately what kind of decision was sitting in front of all 3 of them now. "You want to go look at it?" Angela said. "Not really a question. I want to know what's inside it before Wright realizes Alan talked to anyone." Kathleen looked between them, feeling the full weight of what she was about to ask settle onto her shoulders. "That means tonight, before he has a chance to move anything or clean anything up, or decide that a scared sergeant with shaking hands is a liability he needs to handle the way he's apparently handled every other liability that's threatened this operation for the last 8 years. That's not recon, Robinson. That's trespassing on a private lease with 0 legal cover and 0 backup if it goes wrong. I know exactly what it is." Joshua looked between the 2 of them, and something steady settled into his expression. The particular calm of a young sergeant deciding, deliberately, and with full understanding of the risk, exactly where he stood. "I can pull satellite imagery of the site before we move. Get us a layout, entry points, vehicle activity, anything that tells us what we're actually walking into before we're standing in front of it in the dark." "Do it," Kathleen said, quietly. Angela exhaled, long and slow, the sound of someone talking herself into something she already knew she wasn't going to talk herself out of. "If we're doing this, we're doing it smart. No radios that can be traced back to base frequencies. No vehicles logged to any of our names. And if it looks wrong the second we get eyes on it, we walk. No heroics, agreed." "You say that like you mean it, and I still don't fully believe you." "I mean it," Kathleen said, and for once, standing there in the gathering dark, with a name finally attached to 8 years of unanswered questions, she found that she actually did, because somewhere out past the old grain silos, on a stretch of road most of the base had probably driven past 100 times without a second thought, sat the physical proof of everything she'd spent 2 days chasing and 8 years grieving without ever fully understanding why. A warehouse full of answers, guarded by a man calm enough to sit across from her in the officer's mess and call his threats advice, close enough to shake her hand in the light of day, while quietly making sure the truth stayed buried in the dark. She wasn't going to let it stay buried any longer. The three of them left the hangar separately, 10 minutes apart. The way people move when they've decided that whatever happens next needs to happen quietly. And as Kathleen crossed the darkening flight line towards her quarters, to change out of anything that might mark her as military at a glance, she felt the mountains watching her from the edge of the base, patient and gray and indifferent, holding the same silence they'd been holding for 8 years, waiting to see whether tonight would finally be the night that silence broke for good. Somewhere past those mountains, past the ridgeline that had swallowed Edward Harris whole and nearly swallowed 6 more lives 2 nights ago, a warehouse sat full of secrets that a man with a badge and an easy smile had spent years making sure nobody found. Kathleen Robinson intended to find them anyway. Tonight, whatever it cost her. And as she pulled her jacket closed against the cooling night air and turned toward whatever came next, she understood, with a certainty that settled deep and cold into her chest, that she was no longer just chasing an answer. She was about to become a target. The drive out to Route 9 took 40 minutes in Angela's personal truck, headlights off for the last 2 miles, running only on the thin gray wash of a moon that kept sliding in and out behind low cloud, like it couldn't decide whether it wanted to be a witness tonight. Joshua sat in the back seat with a laptop balanced on his knees, satellite imagery glowing faint blue against his face, calling out turns in a low voice that had none of its usual easy confidence left in it. Half a mile out, access road on your left, unmarked gravel. Imagery from this afternoon shows 2 vehicles parked behind the main structure. No visible activity in the last pass, but that was 6 hours ago. Could be different now. Copy. Angela eased off the gas, the truck rolling to a stop in the shadow of a stand of dead cottonwoods a 1/4 mile short of the property line. This is as close as I'm driving. We walk from here. The night air had gone sharp and cold, the kind of cold that made every sound feel closer than it was. Gravel shifting under boots, wind moving through brush. Somewhere far off, the low mechanical hum of what might have been a generator, or might have been nothing at all. Kathleen led them along the tree line, staying low, staying quiet, the old instincts from 14 years of combat, flying, translating themselves with effort into 14 minutes of careful ground movement toward a building that had no business existing this far off any official supply chain. The warehouse itself sat low and unremarkable, corrugated metal walls gone rust-colored in patches, a single security light burning over a loading dock that looked, at first glance, exactly like 100 other private storage leases scattered across the high desert, except the fence line was wrong. Too tall, too new, topped with wire that didn't belong on a building storing nothing more valuable than farm equipment or seasonal overflow. And the 2 vehicles parked behind it, visible now through a gap in the fence slats, were government pattern trucks, with their unit markings stripped, the kind of deliberate anonymity that told her more than any label ever could have. That's not a civilian lease, Angela whispered, crouched beside her in the dark. Nobody strips markings off trucks that size, unless they've got a reason to make sure nobody can trace them back. Which means Alan was telling the truth. Kathleen kept her eyes on the loading dock, on the single door standing slightly ajar beneath the security light, a detail that felt less like carelessness and more like an invitation she didn't trust for 1 second. We're not going in. Not tonight. I want photographs, vehicle plates, anything Joshua can log without us setting foot past that fence. Copy, Joshua breathed, already lifting a small camera from his jacket, the shutter silent on its lowest setting, as he began working through a careful sequence of frames, the fence, the trucks, the loading dock, the security light, casting its narrow cone of gold across gravel that had clearly seen recent, heavy traffic, because that was the discipline that separated proof from suspicion, and Kathleen had learned a long time ago, in the wreckage of a case she'd let slip away 8 years earlier. For lack of exactly this kind of documentation, that suspicion without proof only got you dismissed, filed away, called grief-clouding judgment, by people who had never had to carry the weight of being right and unable to show it. She was 3 photographs into the sequence, crouched low against the cold, when then the sound reached her, faint at first, easy to mistake for wind, and then unmistakably not wind at all. An engine, approaching from the access road behind them, headlights still off, moving with the careful, deliberate speed of a vehicle that already knew exactly where it was going and didn't want to announce its arrival. Down, she breathed, and all 3 of them dropped flat into the cold dirt beneath the tree line. As the vehicle rolled past on the gravel road not 40 feet from where they lay, its headlights dark, its engine barely above idle, moving toward the warehouse with the unhurried confidence of someone arriving somewhere they belonged. It stopped at the loading dock. A door opened. A figure stepped out, unhurried, adjusting a jacket collar against the cold, and for one long, breathless second, the security light over the dock caught his face clearly enough that Kathleen didn't need a second look to know exactly who she was staring at across 100 yards of dark gravel. Jonathan Wright. Beside her, she felt Angela go rigid, felt Joshua's breathing stop entirely for a beat too long, and Kathleen lay flat against the cold ground with her heart hammering against her ribs and hammering against every instinct she'd built. Across 14 years of combat flying screaming at her to hold perfectly, absolutely still, because the difference between proof and disaster tonight had just come down to whether or not 3 people lying in the dirt beneath a stand of dead cottonwoods made a single sound in the next 30 seconds. Wright stood at the loading dock a moment longer, glancing once toward the tree line in a way that made Kathleen's blood go cold. A slow, deliberate sweep that felt less like paranoia and more like habit, the practiced caution of a man who had spent years making absolutely certain nobody was ever standing where she was standing right now. Then he turned and disappeared through the door beneath the security light, and the door swung shut behind him with a heavy metal sound and that rolled out across the gravel and the dark and the cold, unhurried finality. None of them moved for a long time. "We need to leave," Angela finally breathed, barely audible. Right now. They retreated the way they'd come, low and slow and silent, every step feeling 3 times longer than the walk-in had, until they reached the truck. And Angela finally allowed herself to breathe out, long and shaking, both hands white knuckled on the wheel, before she'd even turned the key. "That's him," Joshua said, staring at the small screen of his camera, where the last frame sat frozen, Jonathan Wright's face caught clean and unmistakable under gold security light, standing at the door of a warehouse full of equipment that had gotten 3 men killed 2 nights ago. "We have him. On camera. At the site." "We have him at the site," Kathleen said quietly, staring back through the rear window at the low dark shape of the warehouse receding behind them. "We don't have what's inside it yet, and we don't have proof of what he's doing there. Beyond a photograph that any decent lawyer could explain away, as is nothing more than an officer checking on a private storage contract. So what do we do with what we've got?" Kathleen looked down at her own hands in the dim glow of the dashboard lights, steadier now than she expected them to be, and felt the shape of the next several days settle into place, with a clarity that had nothing left of doubt in it. "We build the rest of the case," she said, fast. "Because he saw us near that fence line, whether he clocked exactly who we were or not. And a man who's kept a secret buried for this long is not going to sit still now that he knows somebody's close enough to be standing in his own gravel in the middle of the night." The truck rolled back toward Ironwood through the last hour before dawn, the mountains sitting dark and silent against a sky just beginning faintly to lighten at its eastern edge, and Kathleen watched them pass without really seeing them, her mind already 3 moves ahead, already turning over the small, unshakable certainty that had settled into her chest, somewhere between the loading dock and the tree line. She had spent 8 years wondering whether she would ever get close enough to the truth about Edward Harris to actually touch it. Tonight, for the first time, she had, and somewhere behind her, in a warehouse full of secrets, guarded by a man with an easy smile and a career built on knowing exactly which questions never got asked twice, Jonathan Wright was almost certainly, at this very moment, already beginning to wonder exactly how much she knew, and exactly how far he was going to have to go to make sure it never went any further than the 3 of them and the cold, dark road behind his warehouse door. Because men like that didn't stay calm once they started wondering. They started moving. And whatever moved next was not going to be gentle. Kathleen didn't sleep when she finally got back to her quarters. She sat instead on the edge of her bunk with the photographs Joshua had already forwarded to a drive and nowhere near the base network, scrolling through each frame slowly, memorizing the shape of the fence, the angle of the trucks, the exact moment. Wright's face had turned toward the tree line before he disappeared through that door. Because until tonight, this had been a theory built out of grief and old paperwork and a serial number that could, if she were being honest with herself, still be explained away by someone determined enough to explain it away. Tonight it had a face. Tonight it had a location. Tonight it had a man standing in gold security light at a warehouse he had no business visiting alone after midnight, and no story he could tell afterward that would make that look innocent to anyone willing to actually ask the question out loud. She thought about Edward Harris, about a canyon 2 ridgelines over that had taken him from her 8 years ago, about the 11 minutes his flight log had never been able to explain. She thought about 3 names she still didn't know, about a mother somewhere who was going to open a door in the next day or 2 and have her whole life rearranged by 2 officers standing on her porch with careful, practiced expressions. She thought about Nicholas Allen's shaking hands, about Timothy Clark asking to be looped in from a hospital bed, about Angela's white-knuckled grip on a steering wheel and Joshua's steady voice calling out turns in the dark, and she understood. Sitting there in the gray hour before real dawn, with proof finally within reach for the first time in 8 long years, that whatever came next was going to cost more than any of them had spent so far. Wright had seen movement near his warehouse tonight. Men like him did not wait patiently to find out who had been standing in the dark watching them. The next move belonged to him now, and she had no way of knowing yet exactly how far he was willing to go to make sure it was the last move she ever got to make. Good Part 2 is set at 3,866 words, within acceptable range of the 4,000 target. Here it is. The summons came at 700, delivered not by radio but by a young airman standing stiff at Kathleen's door, with a folder he clearly did not want to be holding. Colonel White wants you in his office. Now, ma'am, because now meant, now, an airman who got sent to fetch majors personally, instead of just calling it in, were airmen who had already been told this conversation mattered enough to watch for stalling. White's office smelled like cold coffee, and something worse underneath it, the particular staleness of a room where bad news had been sitting for a while before she walked in. He did not offer her a seat. That told her more than anything he said in the first 30 seconds. Sit down, Robinson. I'll stand, sir. Sit down. That's not a request. She sat. He slid a printed memo across the desk, and she read it twice before the words fully landed, because the first time through her brain refused to accept what it was looking at. A formal inquiry. Unauthorized access to restricted logistics files. Conduct unbecoming, pending review. Filed that morning by name against Major Kathleen Robinson. Filed by who? White's jaw was tight enough that a muscle jumped along it. Colonel Wright's office. He's alleging you and 2 enlisted personnel accessed classified supply records without authorization, and that you've been harassing junior personnel with unfounded accusations. He's requesting you be pulled from flight status pending review, because of course he had gotten there first. because a man who had spent 8 years learning exactly how paperwork worked would never wait around to be accused, when he could simply become the one doing the accusing. And Kathleen felt something cold and furious settle behind her ribs even as she kept her voice level. "That's not what happened, sir. I know that's not what happened. I also know that doesn't matter nearly as much as I wish it did. Because right now, what's on paper is a formal complaint with a colonel's signature on it, and all you've got is a photograph of a man standing outside a warehouse and a scared sergeant who hasn't gone on record with anything yet." She stared at the memo, at Wright's clean, confident signature at the bottom, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost like relief, exactly what kind of fight this had become. Not a quiet investigation anymore, a race. Whoever built the stronger case first was going to be the one still standing at the end of it, because that was the part that stung worst. Sitting there in a chair she hadn't wanted, being told by a man she respected that the truth mattered less right now than which piece of paper had landed on a desk first. She had spent 14 years building a record clean enough that nobody would think twice about her judgment under fire. And Wright had spent maybe an hour undoing all of it with a single signature and a well-timed complaint filed before she'd even finished her coffee. "Am I grounded, Colonel?" "Pending review, effective immediately." He didn't like saying it. She could hear that, in the flatness of his voice, the particular reluctance of a commander handing down an order he thought was wrong, but couldn't yet justify refusing. "You've got 72 hours before this goes up the chain to Wing Command. After that, it's out of my hands entirely." 72 hours. Because that was the whole game now. Laid out plain on a folding table in a cramped office that smelled like old coffee. 72 hours to turn a photograph and a frightened man's whispered confession into something that couldn't be explained away, buried, or quietly reassigned into irrelevance, the way Edward Harris's death had been 8 years ago. She left White's office already moving, already building the next 12 hours in her head, before her boots hit the gravel outside, and found Angela waiting exactly where she expected, leaning against the hangar wall, with an expression that said she'd already heard. "Grounded," Angela said, not a question. "Pending review." 72 hours. That son of a Angela caught herself, glanced around out of habit, even though nobody stood close enough to hear. He filed first. "Smart, ugly, but smart. We don't have time to be impressed by it." Kathleen kept walking, Angela falling into step beside her. "Where's Joshua?" "Pulling Wright's assignment history like you asked. Found something an hour ago he wanted to show you in person." Wouldn't say what over an open line. They found him in the same corner of the maintenance hangar, laptop open, a look on his face that mixed excitement with something closer to dread, the particular expression of a man who had found exactly what he was looking for and immediately wished he hadn't. "Ma'am." I cross-referenced Wright's postings against every flagged incident I could find going back 10 years. He wasn't at Ironwood 8 years ago, but he was stationed 40 minutes from here, at a logistics coordination post, the same week Colonel Harris went down. The words landed slow, then all at once, the way the worst kind of confirmation always did. "Same week," Kathleen repeated. "Same week. Different base, but close enough that travel wasn't an obstacle. And I found a fuel requisition under his authorization code for a vehicle that left that base the night before Harris's flight and didn't return a log entry until 2 days after the crash." Joshua turned the screen toward her. "I don't have proof of what he did in that window, but I have proof he wasn't where his official assignment said he was supposed to be." 11 minutes, Kathleen said quietly, half to herself. Harris's flight log was 11 minutes off from his flight plan, and Wright was unaccounted for 2 full days around the exact same event. "That's not a coincidence," Angela said. "Nobody at this point believes it's a coincidence." Because it wasn't, and all 3 of them knew it now, with a certainty that no longer needed to be spoken carefully around, and Kathleen felt 8 years of grief reshape itself, in real time, into something with teeth and a face and a paper trail, finally long enough to hang him with, if only they could assemble it, before the 72 hours ran out. "We need Alan on record," she said. "Today, not tomorrow. I already reached out." Angela said, "He's not answering his phone." The words sat in the air a half-second too long before the meaning caught up with all three of them at once. "He's not answering," Joshua repeated slower. Kathleen was already moving toward the door. They found the motor pool short one mechanic, and long one very worried supervisor, who told them, with the particular unease of a man reporting something he didn't understand yet, that Nicholas Allen had left mid-shift the evening before, citing a family emergency, and hadn't checked in since. His quarters were empty. His personal vehicle was gone. Nobody had heard from him, because that wasn't a coincidence either, and Kathleen stood in the empty barracks room where Allen's bunk sat stripped and abandoned. His few personal effects gone, except for a single photograph left behind on the floor near the wall locker, half slid under it, as if it had fallen and nobody had bothered, or dared, to pick it back up. She crouched and pulled it free. A younger Allen, arm around a woman close to his own age, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. The photograph creased soft at one corner from being carried a long time. "He said it wasn't about him getting in trouble," Kathleen said quietly. "Said it was about what happens after, to people he cares about." Angela's face had gone pale. "You think Wright got to him?" "I think Wright made good on exactly the kind of threat that keeps a scared man quiet for 14 months since, and I think we just watched it happen without knowing it was happening." The three of them stood in that stripped, silent room for a long moment, the weight of it settling differently onto each of them, and Kathleen felt something in her chest go very cold and very still, the particular calm that came right before a decision that couldn't be walked back. "We're not waiting 72 hours, she said. "We move on the warehouse tonight, not recon. Infot photographs from a tree line. We go in. We document what's actually inside it, and we bring it back before Wright has time to clean the site, the way he's apparently already cleaned Allen out of the picture." "That's not proof gathering anymore," Angela said carefully. "That's a break-in. I know exactly what it is, Robinson. If this goes wrong, it's not a career-ending review. It's federal charges, for all three of us." Kathleen looked at her, at Joshua, at the quiet steadiness in both their faces, despite everything she'd just asked of them, and felt, underneath the fear, something that had been missing from her for 8 long years finally settle fully into place. Then it goes wrong quietly, or it doesn't go wrong at all. She folded the photograph carefully and slid it into her jacket pocket, a promise she didn't say out loud. "But I am not letting a man disappear because he trusted me enough to tell the truth, and then walking away from the one chance I have to make that mean something." Angela held her gaze a long moment, then exhaled, slow and final. "Midnight," she said. "I'll get the truck ready." The 72 hours had become something much smaller now, something measured less in days than in the narrowing space between one dangerous decision and the next, and as the three of them scattered back into the ordinary rhythm of a base that had no idea how close it was, standing to the edge of something, Kathleen felt the mountains watching again from beyond the fence line, patient, gray, indifferent, the way they had watched Edward Harris disappear into them 8 years ago and had watched 6 strangers nearly join 2 nights past. She was done letting those mountains keep their secrets. Tonight, one way or another, that changed. Midnight found them parked in the same shadow of dead cottonwoods as before, except this time nobody sat idle behind the wheel, waiting to photograph and retreat. Angela killed the engine and looked back at both of them. Her voice dropped to something barely above a breath. "Once we're past that fence, there's no clean way to explain why we're there. You both understand that?" "We understand," Kathleen said, "which is exactly why nobody makes a sound they don't have to, and nobody touches anything they don't photograph first." Joshua checked the small case slung across his chest, camera, a compact recorder, gloves already pulled on. "Perimeter's quiet. No vehicles behind the structure tonight. If Wright's watching this place, he's not watching it in person. That we know of," Angela muttered, but she was already moving, low and fast along the tree line the way she had 2 nights before, except this time Her feet carried her past the point where they'd turned back, toward the gap in the fence line Joshua had marked on his satellite imagery as the weakest section of wire. The cut took less than a minute. Angela's hands steady and quick, with a pair of bolt cutters. Kathleen hadn't asked where she'd gotten, and then they were through, crossing open gravel toward the loading dock. With nothing but a security light, and 8 years of unanswered questions standing between them and whatever this building had been built to hide. The side door Wright had used 2 nights ago sat unlocked, which told Kathleen everything about how confident he'd become in this place being untouchable, and the three of them slipped through into a darkness that smelled like machine oil and something sharper underneath it, cold metal and dust, and faintly the particular chemical scent of ordnance stored somewhere close. Joshua's flashlight beam found rows of crates first, stacked deep along the near wall, stenciled with transfer codes that meant nothing to Kathleen's eye until Angela crouched beside one and ran her fingers along a serial sequence stamped into the wood. "This is it," Angela breathed. "Same lot numbering as the discrepancy reports. This is the shipment that was supposed to have gone missing 14 months ago. It didn't go missing. It came here." Kathleen moved past her, deeper into the structure, her flashlight sweeping across a workbench cluttered with disassembled communications gear, components she recognized now with a sick, cold certainty from the scorched circuitry Joshua had shown her days ago, and beyond that, a second bank of crates stacked higher than her head, fresh enough that the wood still smelled faintly of the mill. Because this wasn't storage. This was a supply line, active and ongoing, moving weapons and equipment out from under an American base and into the hands of exactly the network that had killed 3 men 2 nights ago, and Kathleen felt the full scale of it settle into her chest with a weight that made the 72 hours sitting on her career and feel almost insultingly small by comparison. "Ma'am," Joshua's voice had gone tight, urgent. "You need to see this." He stood at a small metal filing cabinet near the workbench, one drawer already pulled open, and inside it sat a slim folder that he lifted out with careful, gloved fingers before angling his flashlight across the label, typed neatly along the tab. Harris E. Incident Review. Restricted. Kathleen's breath caught somewhere behind her ribs. She took the folder from him, with hands that had gone, for the first time in 14 years of flying into gunfire, genuinely unsteady, and opened it there in the dark, flashlight beam trembling slightly across. Pages she had spent 8 years wondering whether she would ever get to see. A second flight log. Not the one filed officially. This one showed a route deviation ordered, in writing by a logistics coordination authorization that traced back to the same base Joshua had already connected to Wright's unaccounted for travel window. A single handwritten note clipped to the final page, unsigned, 3 words that told her everything the official report had spent 8 years refusing to say. Contain the exposure. Because Edward Harris hadn't died from weather. He had died because he'd found exactly what she was standing in the middle of right now, a supply line running stolen equipment out through Ironwood's back door, and someone had decided, in careful, deliberate handwriting, that the safest way to protect that secret was to make sure the man who found it never got the chance to report it. She stood there in the dark, the folder trembling slightly in her hands, 8 years of grief and doubt and quiet, unspoken suspicion finally collapsing into something with shape, and something in her chest broke open. At the same moment, something else in it, colder and steadier, closed like a fist around what she now knew for certain. She thought of the funeral, of the folded flag placed into his sister's hands, of 8 years spent being called the pilot, who couldn't let go, and felt something in her chest that was not quite grief, and not quite rage but some cold, exact combination of both, sharpened now into something she could finally use, instead of simply carry. "We have it," she said, voice barely audible even to her own ears. "We finally have it." Behind her, Angela's flashlight swept once toward the rear of the warehouse, toward a service door Kathleen hadn't noticed yet, and her voice cut through the dark with sudden, sharp urgency that scattered every other thought clean out of Kathleen's head. Headlights, coming up the access road fast. Joshua killed his flashlight instantly, the warehouse dropping into full dark except for the thin security light, bleeding faintly through the gaps around the loading dock, and Kathleen shoved the folder inside her jacket, pressed flat against her ribs beside the photograph she'd carried out of Alan's empty room, and felt her pulse hammering as she strained to hear how many vehicles, how many doors, how much time they had left before whoever was ever found 3 people standing in the middle of everything they'd spent 2 days trying to prove. "We need out now," Angela breathed, already moving toward the gap in the fence, and Kathleen followed, folder pressed tight against her chest, the mountains beyond the perimeter fence, sitting dark and silent, and utterly indifferent to the fact that the truth she had chased for 8 years now weighed exactly as much as a single thin folder, and exactly as much as the run, still standing between her and getting it somewhere safe. They cleared the gap in the fence, with headlights already sweeping across the gravel behind them, close enough now that Kathleen could hear the engine note change as the vehicle slowed toward the loading dock, and she didn't look back. Didn't let herself look back, because looking back was how people got caught, and getting caught tonight didn't just mean the end of a career. It meant the end of the one piece of proof, the one piece of proof that could still put Edward Harris's death, and 3 more names she still didn't know exactly where they belonged. The tree line swallowed them whole, branches tearing at sleeves, gravel giving way to soft dirt that muffled their footsteps just enough, and behind them, a second set of headlights joined the first, sweeping slow and methodical across the warehouse perimeter in a pattern that told Kathleen, even at a dead run, that whoever had arrived wasn't searching randomly. They were searching like people who already suspected exactly what they were looking for. Angela had the truck moving before all 3 doors had fully closed. No headlights, easing out onto the access road at a speed that felt agonizingly slow, given everything happening less than a quarter mile behind them. And it wasn't until the warehouse had disappeared entirely behind a fold of dark hillside that anyone in the truck remembered to breathe. Joshua's hands were shaking as he pulled his phone from his jacket, checking the small camera he'd carried the whole run, without ever quite registering. He still had it clenched in one fist. Photos are intact. Recorder caught the crate labels before we lost light. And the folder, Angela said, glancing at Kathleen in the rearview mirror. Kathleen pulled it free from inside her jacket, checked it by the dim glow of the dashboard lights. Every page still there, the unsigned note still clipped exactly where she'd found it, intact. Nobody spoke again, until Ironwood's perimeter lights came into view against the paling edge of the sky. And even then, it was Angela who finally broke the silence, her voice rough with the particular exhaustion that came after fear had nowhere left to go. "We have proof now. Real proof. Enough to bury him. We have enough to start burying him," Kathleen said quietly, watching the base grow closer through the windshield. "We don't have Alan. We don't know if he's safe, or scared, or something worse, and until we do, Wright still has leverage. We can't counter with a folder and some photographs. So what happens when we walk this into White's office in the morning?" Joshua asked. "You think Wright just lets that happen quietly?" Kathleen looked down at the folder in her lap, at Edward Harris's name, typed clean and official across a label that had spent 8 years locked inside a warehouse, instead of an evidence file where it belonged, and felt the shape of everything still ahead of them settle into place with a clarity that had nothing gentle left in it. "No," she said, "he doesn't let anything happen quietly, which means from the moment we walk into that office, we're not just building a case anymore. We're daring a man who's already made one person disappear to come after the 3 of us next, in the open, where he can't hide behind a filing cabinet or an empty evidence locker." The truck rolled to a stop in the shadow of the maintenance hangar, just as the first real light of morning broke over the ridgeline, gold and indifferent, and Kathleen sat there a moment longer with the folder pressed against her chest, thinking of Nicholas Allen's empty barracks room of a photograph left behind on the floor, like something too painful to carry any further, of 72 hours that had already burned down to something closer to 40, and of a man somewhere on this base who was, at this exact moment, almost certainly already calculating exactly how much damage 3 people and 1 thin folder were capable of doing to 8 years of careful, patient silence. She was about to find out whether that calculation came out in her favor or in his. Angela cut the engine and sat there a moment with both hands still on the wheel, staring out at the flight line, waking slowly around them. Ground crews starting their morning checks, an aircraft somewhere down the row coughing to life with a familiar whine. That, under any other circumstance, would have felt like nothing at all. "We should get some sleep before this goes any further," she said, not sounding like she believed it herself. "None of us are sleeping," Joshua said quietly, and nobody argued with him. Kathleen climbed out into the cool morning air, the folder still pressed flat against her ribs beneath her jacket, and looked out toward the mountains one more time, the same ridgelines that had taken Edward Harris from her, that had nearly taken 6 strangers 2 nights ago, that had just handed her, inside a rusted warehouse full of stolen equipment, the first real proof in 8 years that none of it had ever been an accident at all. 72 hours had become something else now. Not a countdown toward losing her wings. A countdown toward whatever Jonathan Wright decided to do. The moment he realized his warehouse had been walked through in the dark by the one officer. On this base, he'd spent 2 days trying to discredit, before she got close enough to matter. She thought of Nicholas Allen's empty bunk, of the photograph, still folded carefully in her pocket, and made herself a promise, standing there in the gold early light, quiet and absolute, the same kind of promise she'd made to herself 8 years ago, and finally, this time, intended to keep all the way through to the end. Whatever Wright did next, she was not going to be the one left standing in the dark, without answers again. Because she had spent 8 years learning what it cost to stay silent. She was done paying that particular price for anyone else's comfort. Part 3 is complete at 3,700 words. Here it is. Colonel White read the folder twice before he said anything at all, and when he finally looked up, something in his face had changed in a way Kathleen had never seen on him before. The particular stillness of a career officer realizing the ground under his own command had been rotten for years, without him ever catching the smell of it. "Where did you get this?" "I'm not going to answer that in a way that puts anyone else at risk, sir. What matters is what's in it." White set the folder down slowly, both hands flat on the desk on either side of it, like he needed the contact to steady something. "This puts Wright at the scene of Harris's death. Not near it, at it. Contain the exposure in his authorization chain on the same week his travel records go dark. It puts him close enough that I don't think it's a coincidence anymore, sir. And I don't think you do either." He was quiet a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something flatter, harder, the sound of a man deciding, in real time, which version of his career he was willing to live with. "I'm calling this up the chain today. Not 72 hours from now. Today. And Robinson, I want you to understand something. The second I make that call, there's no controlling how Wright reacts. A man who's kept a secret this size buried for 8 years does not respond well to watching it dug back up in a single morning. I understand that, sir. Do you? Because I don't think you fully understand what a cornered man is capable of, until you've watched one decide he's got nothing left to lose." He set both hands flat on the desk, staring down at Harris's folder like it might still burn him if he touched it wrong. 8 years, Robinson. I signed off on that investigation closing. I read the same report you did, and I let it go because that's what the paperwork told me to do. I don't know how I live with that once this is public. You live with it the same way I did, Kathleen said quietly, by making sure it never happens to anyone else on your watch again. He picked up his phone before she could answer, and the sound of him dialing wing command felt, in that small office, like the pulling of a pin, quiet and final and impossible to take back. Kathleen left his office, with instructions to stay on base, stay visible, and stay away from right until formal notification went out. Instructions she intended to follow for exactly as long as it took her to find Angela and Joshua and make sure both of them understood what was coming. She found them at the hangar, and the look on Joshua's face told her before he said a word that the morning wasn't done delivering complications. Ma'am? I ran a trace on Alan's phone before it went dark last night. Cell tower ping put him 40 minutes east of here around 2,300, then nothing. But I found something else while I was in the system. A flagged vehicle stop, county sheriff's report, filed an hour after that last ping. Description matches his truck. No arrest, no citation. Just a stop logged, then released. Released by who? Deputy on scene noted the vehicle was released into the custody of a federal liaison who showed credentials on site. No name in the report. Just a badge number that traces back to an office that doesn't officially exist on paper. The kind of designation that gets used when somebody wants a trail that goes nowhere. Because that told her everything she needed to know about how far Wright's reach actually extended. Past the base, past the county line, into whatever quiet arrangement let a man flash a badge at a highway stop and make a frightened witness disappear, without a single official record of where he'd gone. He's not dead, Kathleen said, more to steady her own voice than because she believed it with any certainty. If Wright wanted him dead, he wouldn't have bothered with a badge and a story. He'd have just made it look like an accident, the way he made Harris look like one. Angela's jaw was tight. So what's he doing with him? Keeping him somewhere quiet until he knows exactly how much damage we're about to do, which means we don't have days anymore. We might not have hours. She was 3 steps toward the operations building, already turning the next move over in her head, when the base intercom crackled to life overhead, a voice she didn't immediately place calling for all available personnel to report to the flight line for an emergency tasking, and something in the flat, urgent cadence of it made her stomach drop before the details even finished broadcasting. Distress call, Sector 14, civilian vehicle reported off-road near the county line, occupant status unknown, requesting immediate air support for search and locate, Sector 14. Kathleen felt the pieces slide into place with a speed that made her chest go cold. That's the same stretch of county road Joshua's trace had put Alan's last known ping. You're grounded, Angela said, already knowing what Kathleen was thinking before she said it out loud. Pending review, remember. You can't fly this. Then somebody else flies it, and I go along on the ground team, because if that's Alan out there, and Wright's people put him there, I am not letting anyone else be the one who finds him first. She was already moving toward the ready room, and behind her, Angela and Joshua fell into step without needing to be asked. 3 people who had spent 2 sleepless days building toward exactly this kind of moment and had no intention of stopping short of it now. The convoy reached the coordinates 40 minutes later, an ambulance and 2 security vehicles rolling to a stop along a stretch of gravel shoulder where a single sedan sat nose down in a shallow drainage ditch, driver's door hanging open, no sign of the driver anywhere along the roadside. Kathleen was out of the vehicle before it had fully stopped, scanning the ditch line, the scrub brush beyond it, every instinct she'd built across 14 years of search and rescue screaming that this wasn't an accident. This was staged, arranged carefully enough to look plausible to anyone who didn't already know exactly what they were looking for. Ma'am, one of the security personnel called out from 20 yards down the ditch, crouched beside a shape half hidden in tall grass, and Kathleen crossed the distance at a dead run, heart hammering, bracing herself for the worst, before she'd even fully registered what she was looking at. Nicholas Allen lay curled on his side in the wet grass, alive, breathing, a bruise darkening along one cheekbone and his wrists, showing the raw red marks of restraints recently removed, but alive. And Kathleen dropped to her knees beside him, with a relief so sharp it nearly buckled her. Sergeant, can you hear me? His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then sharpening as recognition worked its way through whatever haze he'd been left in. Major, his voice came out cracked, barely a whisper, They said if I talked, they'd my sister. They said they'd go after my sister. Nobody's going after anyone, she said, gripping his shoulder, steady, deliberate. You're safe now. I need you to tell me who did this. Exactly as much as you can remember. Because we finally have enough to make sure this is the last time anyone gets to threaten you over it. He talked for 11 minutes, while the medics worked around him, halting at first, then faster, the whole story finally spilling loose. After 14 months of careful, frightened silence, a name confirming everything the folder already suggested, a description of the man who'd pulled him off the road, the night before, matching exactly the careful, unhurried figure Kathleen had watched disappear through a warehouse door. 2 nights running. By the time the ambulance pulled away with Alan inside it, stable, guarded now by 2 of the security personnel who had come to distrust the chain of command enough to take Kathleen's word over standard protocol, she had everything she needed. A witness willing to testify. A folder linking right directly to Edward Harris's death. Photographs of a working supply line stocked with stolen military equipment, and a badge number that traced back to an office that officially did not exist. It was, finally, enough. Except Jonathan Wright had reached the same conclusion at almost exactly the same moment, because when Kathleen's convoy rolled back through Ironwood's main gate 2 hours later, it was to find the base in a state of controlled chaos. Security personnel, moving with the particular urgency of people responding to something that had already gone badly wrong, and Colonel White, standing at the center of it, with an expression that told her, before he said a single word, exactly whose absence had triggered the alarm. Wright's gone, White said flatly. Cleared out his quarters sometime in the last 3 hours. Personal vehicles missing. He knew this morning's call to Wing Command was coming, and he didn't wait around to find out how it landed. Where would he run? I don't know, but I know he's not the kind of man who runs without a plan, which means wherever he's headed, it's somewhere he's already prepared for exactly this outcome. Kathleen felt the shape of it settle into place with a cold, clear certainty. The warehouse. He's not running from the evidence. He's going back to clean it out before we can secure the site officially, because right now everything we found is still sitting there unwitnessed by anyone with the authority to make it matter in a courtroom. White was already reaching for his radio. I'll get security police rolling. You are not going out there again, Robinson. You are grounded, under formal review, and I am not explaining to Wing Command why my most scrutinized officer led an unauthorized pursuit onto civilian road less than 6 hours after her career nearly ended over exactly that kind of decision. Colonel. Kathleen held his gaze, steady, unflinching. Security police rolling in an hour from now finds an empty warehouse and nothing left to prove any of this ever happened. I know that terrain. I know Wright, and I am the only person on this base right now who's spent 8 years learning exactly how patient this man is capable of being when he thinks he's about to lose everything. White studied her a long moment, the calculation of a commander weighing regulation against the plain, ugly truth of the situation in front of him, and whatever he saw in her face finally tipped the scale. You're not flying, he said, but you're riding with security police, and you are not setting foot past that fence line without a badge beside you. That's not a negotiation. Understood, sir. The drive out to Route 9 took half the time it had 2 nights before. 3 security vehicles running with lights dark but engines pushed hard, and Kathleen sat in the back of the lead truck, with Edward Harris's folder still pressed against her chest, watching the mountains slide past the window. Gray and patient, the same mountains that had swallowed him whole 8 years ago, and had almost swallowed 6 strangers 2 nights past. They reached the access road to find the warehouse gate standing open. 1 government patent truck, already pulled up to the loading dock, its engine still ticking as it cooled, and Kathleen felt every old instinct from 14 years of combat flying settle into the particular calm that came right before something irreversible. He's still here, she said quietly. He wasn't clearing out, he was destroying it. The security team moved in fast and disciplined, and Kathleen came in behind them, close enough to see through the open-loading dock door the moment they found him. Jonathan Wright, standing amid the crates, with a gas can already emptied across the nearest stack, a lighter held loose and almost forgotten in one hand. His easy, practiced smile finally completely gone, replaced by something rawer and far less composed. Colonel Wright, step away from the crates. Hands where we can see them. He looked up, and for one long moment, his eyes found Kathleen's across the warehouse floor, past the security personnel already moving to flank him, and something in his expression shifted, not quite fear, not quite defeat, but the particular exhausted recognition of a man. Realizing the careful architecture of 8 years had finally, completely, collapsed. "You have no idea what you've actually done," he said, voice low, almost conversational despite everything. "This wasn't just me. You understand that? You think one colonel builds something this size alone? Then tell us who else," Kathleen said, stepping closer despite the tension radiating off every security officer in the room. "Tell us. And maybe there's still a version of today that doesn't end with you standing in a burning building, holding the only proof of what you did to Edward Harris." Something passed behind his eyes. Calculation, the same calculation she'd watched him run in the officers' mess days ago, except this time there was nowhere left for it to land, no clever framing, no advice disguised as a threat, nothing but a lighter in his hand, and a room full of people who already knew exactly what he was. He set the lighter down on the crate beside him, slow, deliberate, and raised both hands. "I want a lawyer," he said quietly. "And I want it on record that I never wanted Harris dead. That was never supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to find the shipment that night. He got there faster than the schedule accounted for. And by the time anyone realized, it was already too late to do anything but contain it." "Contain it," Kathleen repeated, the two words landing with the full, cold weight of everything they'd cost. "That's what you called it. A man's life. Contained." Wright didn't answer that, and there was nothing left in his silence that Kathleen needed. The security team moved him out through the loading dock in restraints, past crates full of stolen equipment that would spend the next several months being catalogued, cross-referenced, traced back through 14 months of quiet betrayal, and Kathleen stood alone in the warehouse a moment longer, the folder still pressed against her chest, watching gray morning light bleed through the open door across a floor that had finally, after 8 long years, stopped hiding what it had always known. She walked the length of the warehouse once more. Before she let herself leave, past the crates, past the workbench cluttered with disassembled communications gear, past the filing cabinet that had held Edward Harris's name locked away in the dark for 8 years. While everyone who loved him had been told, over and over, that his death was simply weather and bad luck, she ran her fingers once along the edge of the workbench, an old habit from years of pre-flight inspections, checking things by touch, the way she'd been trained to, though there was nothing left here for her hands to find that her eyes hadn't already taken in. Outside, the security convoy was already loading evidence, careful and methodical, now that the fire had been stopped before it started, and Angela met her at the fence line with an expression that held more relief in it than either of them were ready to name out loud yet. "You good?" Angela asked. "I don't know yet," Kathleen said honestly. "Ask me again once this actually feels real." "It'll take a while," Joshua said quietly, coming up beside them, his camera still slung across his chest, the same one that had documented the proof that finally broke 8 years of silence, wide open. "Feeling real, I mean. I don't think something like this just settles overnight." "No," Kathleen agreed, looking back once at the warehouse, at Wright's silhouette, disappearing into the back of a security vehicle, restrained and silent and finally, completely powerless. "It doesn't." The weeks that followed moved faster than she expected, and slower than she wanted, formal hearings and depositions, and a federal investigation that widened, exactly as Wright had promised, into something far larger than one colonel and one warehouse, a network that had been quietly bleeding equipment and intelligence out of 3 different installations. For the better part of a decade, Nicholas Allen testified, protected now, his sister relocated with quiet, careful federal assistance that finally made good on the kind of promise Kathleen had made him in a motor pool break room days that felt, somehow, like a lifetime ago. He found Kathleen once more, before the case moved into its final phase, standing awkwardly at the edge of the flight line in civilian clothes, his discharge paperwork already filed, a fresh start waiting for him somewhere far from the mountains. That had nearly cost him everything. "I never got to say it properly," he said. "Thank you for believing a scared sergeant over a colonel with a clean record and a signature that mattered more than mine. You told the truth when it would have been easier not to," Kathleen said. "That's the part that mattered. I just made sure it didn't disappear the way it almost did." He nodded, something loosening in his shoulders that had been tight for 14 months straight, and shook her hand before he left. The same careful, deliberate gesture Timothy Clark had offered days after the ambush that started all of this. 2 men who had learned, in very different ways, exactly what it cost to trust someone with the truth, and exactly what it was worth once that trust finally paid off. Timothy Clark, still healing, sat through his own deposition with the same steady composure he'd shown from a hospital bed, and afterward found Kathleen outside the courthouse and shook her hand a second time, longer this time, saying nothing, because nothing needed saying. Colonel White stood beside her at the ceremony that finally, 8 years late, corrected Edward Harris's official record, his death reclassified, his name read aloud, in a room full of people who had spent nearly a decade believing a story that had never once been true. His sister was there, older now than the photograph. Kathleen still kept in her own memory from the funeral all those years ago, and when the reading finished she crossed the room slowly and took both of Kathleen's hands in hers. "They told me for 8 years it was an accident," she said, voice unsteady but not breaking. "I always wondered why nobody who flew with him ever quite believed that. Now I know why. I should have found this sooner," Kathleen said. "I'm sorry it took this long." "You found it," his sister said simply. "That's what matters. Some families never get that. Mine did because of you." Kathleen stood at attention through the whole thing. Dress uniform heavier than she remembered, and did not cry until the room had emptied, and it was just her and the mountains outside the window, gray and quiet and, for the first time in 8 years, no longer holding anything back from her. Angela found her afterward in the parking lot, leaning against her truck with 2 cups of coffee, one already extended the way it always was. "Terrible, as promised," Angela said. "I'll take terrible." They stood there a while in comfortable silence, the particular kind 2 people share after finishing something enormous together, and it was Angela who finally broke it, glancing sideways with the ghost of her old easy humor finally starting to surface again. "So, what now, Robinson? You've spent 8 years chasing this. Kind of leaves a hole where the chasing used to be." Kathleen looked out toward the mountains, toward the ridgeline where Edward Harris had gone down, and where she had almost, so many times, let the truth about it go, and felt something settle in her chest that had never quite had room to settle before. Not fully. Not until now. "Now I fly," she said. "Same as always. Except this time I get to do it without carrying all of that with me." Angela smiled, small and real. "Good, because Ironwood's not the same without Storm making everybody else look bad on the flight line." Kathleen almost laughed, the sound coming easier than it had in longer than she could remember, and for a moment, standing there with cold coffee in her hands, and the mountains finally quiet and unburdened behind her, she let herself believe that whatever came next might actually be simple. It wasn't going to stay simple for long. It never did, not in this uniform, not in these mountains. But for the first time in 8 years, she was ready for whatever came next to find her already standing, instead of still searching. She drove back toward Ironwood as the sun dropped low and gold behind the ridgeline, the same ridgeline that had taken Edward Harris and had nearly taken 6 strangers and had, in the end, given her back the one thing 8 years of silence had never let her have. Not closure exactly, something steadier than that. Proof that the truth, however long it took, however many people had to risk everything to drag it into the light, was always worth chasing all the way to the end. The mountains sat behind her in the mirror, gray fading to violet as the light went, holding whatever secrets they still had left. And for the first time since a radio had crackled to life on a cold night 2 weeks ago, Kathleen Robinson drove toward home, without once looking back to see if anything was still following.